All right. So welcome to this edition of the Sankofa African Review interview, because most of the time we've been doing webinars where we have panelists, right, from all kinds of background and different expertise. But today is an interview. My name is Benjamin Akwe. Today's date is May 30th, 2025. It is 1 p.m. US Eastern Time, 4 p.m. GMT, right? I just want our viewers to know that the Sankofa African Review is organized by Bell & Associates Consulting Limited. Bell & Associates Consulting Limited is actually an African policy research and consulting firm that facilitates development projects on behalf of their clients on the African continent. We also advise clients to navigate political risk and the intersection of politics, security, and economics in Africa. So before I get to introduce our guest for today, for those joining us for the first time, right? The Sankofa African Review aims to bridge the gap between those on the African continent and those in the diaspora, right? So if you want to read more about the Sankofa African Review, you can go to Bell & Associates Consulting Limited /Sankofa or BELLANDASSOCIATE.com/Sankofa, which is SANKOFA. Work. So let's continue from there. Sankofa what we normally do is that we bring experts from across the African diaspora, right, to engage in conversations on contemporary issues affecting the African continent, and also to discuss great power strategic relations and objectives towards the African continent, right? So this is what we have been doing. We've been bringing experts from academia, from NGOs, from government, to discuss some of these issues. So many issues happening on the African continent, and we've been doing that for the past 2 years. So today's SR, or what they call the Sankofa African program, is titled Retrospective Analysis of President Biden's Strategy towards Sub-Saharan Africa. What really went wrong? So joining us today is the Honorable Judd Devermont, right? Now, he has a long profile, right? I got his profile from LinkedIn, so he has a very long profile, which I've actually put on our page, right? So I don't want us to get into all those stuff for the sake of time. But those who are interested in trying to read about him, if you go to the Sankofa African page, you see that we've posted his profile over there, right? But the main thing to understand is that he's the one who actually authored the Biden strategy towards Sub-Saharan Africa. So I just want you to know that. So Mr. Davenport, you are welcome to the Sankofa African Review.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Right. Now, to remind our listeners, right, the Sankofa African Review is anchored on a myriad of perspectives. We use what we call narratives, because narratives are part of African world, African society. But in this case, we are using narratives which are based on research. They are based on policy positions, and they are based on realities happening in the various African countries, right? This narrative serves as a guide to our guests, right? So as to help them present their perspectives independently of their organization. Probably they're working for a government or a state agency or a think tank, right? So we are saying that we are using these narratives to help them. So whatever they share over here is not a reflection of the organization that they represent, but whatever they say over here are actually what? Independent. So what we do normally is that we send these narratives to our guests in advance, right? For them to have an idea what to expect, right? We don't tell them the questions, we just give them the narrative that these are the topics, these are the narratives. So expect some of these things. So before we continue, we want to take opening remarks from you, right? In terms of you first time appearing on this program. So your opening remarks.
Sure. Well, look, I'm very honored to be here to talk about U.S. policy towards Africa. I've spent my entire career working on this topic. I was an analyst and a policymaker, and as you point out, Benjamin, I was President Biden's special advisor on Africa. I was the senior director at the National Security Council, and I wrote the Africa strategy. So since we're going to talk about the Africa strategy, maybe I'll just say a couple of things about what I wanted it to do. I think lots of things went really right, but I do have some critiques about what we mean when we say strategies and what are the potential pitfalls. But when I came to the Biden administration,
Okay,
I had
so
written,
hold on. I'll give you the opportunity for you to respond to that, right? Well, this was based on an article that you wrote on April 30th. So I'll give you the
yes,
opportunity for you to respond to that, right?
right. So do you want me to do that now?
No, no, we'll get into that. Then I'll give you the opportunity
What
to
would you
do
like
that.
me to say at this point then,
Okay,
Benjamin?
so okay, if you don't have, let's proceed, right? So for the sake of our listeners who have not read the document, the U.S. African Strategy towards Sub-Saharan Africa, like I said, we posted it on our website, right? Now, if you read the executive summary, right, of the document, it says it reframes the importance of Sub-Saharan Africa to U.S. national interest, right? It identified it outlined four objectives, right? So those objectives: one, foster openness and open societies; two, deliver democratic and security dividends; three, advance pandemic recovery and economic opportunity; and four, support conservation, climate adaptation, and just energy society. But today's interview, we are going to focus our attention on delivering democratic and security dividends. Before I get into the interview, all right. So on April 30th, 2025, Mr. Judd actually wrote an article, right, on strategies where he indicated that, in that article, he indicated that he authored or he wrote the Biden administration. And that was what actually caught my attention because for the past 2 years, we've been discussing US strategy towards Sub-Saharan Africa, right? But we never knew who was behind this. So when I saw that article, I said, wow, okay, let me try to reach out to him because we've been discussing all these things all this while. And fortunately for me, I had the person who actually wrote an article trying to present some arguments on that. So let's go back. Let's get into the conversation. What was your motivation, right? And through what political lens were you trying to write that article?
Sure. Well, thank you for that, Benjamin. Before I joined the Biden administration, I worked at a think tank called the Center for Strategic International Studies. I led the Africa program there, and I wrote an article uh, in August of 2020 called "A 21st Century Framework for U.S.-Africa Relations," and I laid out some ideas. And at the core of it was that we have had the US and our African partners 30 years of a policy that I believe has delivered a lot of benefits, but that had probably run its course. That the world had changed so dramatically and Africa had changed so dramatically. And so it was really important to take a fresh look and to rethink our approach and how we conceptualize Africa's importance, or as the strategy says, reframe. And what I really wanted to do, even more so than the objectives that you laid out, Benjamin, is that I wanted to present to a global audience why Africa really matters and what we would do differently to engage our partners. So I feel very good about the executive summary. There are other parts of the strategy that I don't feel as good about, but the executive summary is really critical to the way that I and the Biden administration thought about Africa. That essentially there is no global priority that we can achieve without African leadership, without African input, without African agency. And it's for all the reasons that I think your audience understands. It's growing demographic boom that 1 out of 4 people in the world will be African by 2050. The fact that there are 30% of the critical minerals that the world needs to power its transition is on the continent. That there are major corridors of trade and travel, that resources such as the Congo Basin is critical. It's the world's second lung, and that Africans are increasingly in critical positions the international system. So not just having 3 members in the Security Council, but when you look at all of the different organizations at the UN level, so the World Trade Organization is led by a Nigerian, right? The World Health Organization is led by an Ethiopian. You have Africans that lead the International Labor Organization, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the La Francophonie, the British Commonwealth. the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And so what I first wanted to do is say, if we want to be successful, we have to recognize that Africa will cast the deciding vote on the future of the world. And that means that the people who need to be interested in Africa are not just Africans or the African diaspora or people like myself who have spent a career working on Africa, but everyone. That's one. And to do that, we need to inject more complexity into our relationships. We can't have a continent or a region where the US defines it by a single issue. We need multiple lenses. So it can't just be about development, and it can't just be about counterterrorism, and it can't just be about competition with China. That we need multiple lenses. All of those, plus climate, plus technology, plus global leadership. We need to think about all of those things. Two, we have to be better at engaging Africans and accepting that we will have disagreements, and then that's okay, and then that's part of the process. In fact, the durable solutions start from disagreements. And that three, the ways in which we have framed Africa policy in the past, which is, almost every Africa strategy, U.S. Africa strategy has talked about democracy and governance, peace and security, trade, investment, and development. Those are all great, but those aren't necessarily ends. Those are means. And so what I wanted us to think about them as not pillars, but as pathways. And then finally, how do we, on every single issue, from the future of space cooperation to trade to technology, have Africans have a seat at the table. So that was the vision of the strategy. That was what I was trying to change because it was my view that we needed to update and reframe our relationship for the 21st century.
Okay. Now, this morning you sent me an article, right? How do you tie into that article which talks about engagement, right? Where you gave me so many examples, right? How do you tie that into what you just said?
Well, if you look at the strategy, there's a section. So I told you that I love the executive summary and the strategic environment sections. I'm very proud of those. But if you skip over the objectives, and then you go to this page called a 21st century U.S. African partnership,
Yeah.
it talks about that we have to, when we have disagreements, we will lean in, agree to meet, and address those differences head on. And that article, and all of the articles that I've been writing in my Substack, which is called Post Strategy, is about thinking about the past, not only the 4 years that I was in the Biden administration, but the history of U.S. Africa policy and how do we do better? What worked, what didn't work? And what I was trying to convey in that was oftentimes in Africa policy spaces in the United States, you have just huge food fights over who's going to meet with who, right? Should we meet with a leader where there are allegations of human rights abuses, or there was a stolen or complicated or flawed election, and everyone kind of puts together arguments for and against. And what I wanted to do is both say we should engage. Here's why. I will be honest about when I decided I didn't want to engage, and maybe I should have had a different policy, and also make a comparison to the rest of the world. Because in the rest of the world, the United States engages, and they engage when they have very vociferous arguments and disagreements. But the only solution to move forward is to engage, and the absence of engagement never leads to a change in policy. So, by virtue of just isolating or marginalizing a country or a leader, I've never seen that end up in a better circumstance for that country or those people or our relationship. So that's really, it was in the Africa strategy. It is something that I believe in. And I wanted to both explain and reflect on my time and how I aligned myself on different issues, how the interagency, the US government argued about those different, how the people who follow Africa very closely in the United States thinks about those issues, and where we should go.
So, how different is your view from Camisa's article that she wrote in 2021 in terms of what went wrong? And she was making the argument that the US should have done more engagement than to be focused on counterterrorism. I don't know whether you've read that article that she wrote in 2021.
I haven't read it. I have a lot of respect for Camisa. Um, I do believe that we should be doing that we should be engaging more. I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs that about U.S. engagement. Um, I think that our engagement is actually not just counterterrorism. That's often the perception, but that pales in comparison to what we have historically done on development and humanitarian assistance. Every African leader that I ever met with in West Africa asked for more security assistance because they viewed that their country was facing an existential threat from extremism or from insecurity. So I do think there's more, but this is why this is important, is that you have to make an argument why that engagement is not just good for a specific African country, but why that benefits the United States and benefits our global community. And if you agree with my thesis that Africa will cast the deciding vote on the future of our world and our global community, then a country that is um, entrenched or enveloped in conflict, or that has low socioeconomic growth, or that is held hostage by authoritarian governments, um, or is not trading in a sufficiently robust enough manner to raise the life of people, they're just not going to be a strong partner on the global stage. That having a seat at the table will be insufficient for leadership. So that's how I connect all of it together. But I do think that there's just sometimes um, a misconception about how much we do on security and how much we do in other facets and what needs to be plussed up.
All right, thank you very much. But for today, since we are doing a retrospection, right, we want to look at what has happened, right?
Sure.
Now you are reframing the strategy, but we want to go back retrospectively. So let's go to the narrative that I sent you. I sent you
Yeah.
a narrative on Africa's democratic crisis, right?
Yeah.
Now we can go back to the time of Bill Clinton, where he is talking about democracy will bring prosperity to Africa, right? So I don't want us to get into all that stuff, right? But I want you to listen to, right, General Langley, right, the African Command, right? He's been in the news for a while, right, for the utterance that he made about Burkina Faso. And also, just 3 days ago, he's in Nairobi for the Chief of Defense meeting. Now, I want you to listen to what he said somewhere, right? Then we'll proceed from there. Isaac, play the video. I want him to play the video so that you comment on that. That will set the stage for our conversation.
Be able to investigate it.
Okay. I want us to talk a little bit broadly now, because we focused on the crisis in Sudan, the war on terror, across the border in Somalia. But do you see, a threat beyond the reference to terrorism? What do you think is the greatest threat in the region at the moment, beyond the common reference, for instance, to terror?
Well, I would just say there's a number of layered threats that I see across the Sahel that emanates downward and could even rise up and back into the Maghreb. When conditions are met, it could exacerbate more instability across the population. That's why I always said that when we look for a solution set, and we're going to be able to table this issue again at this Chad conference. What is the enduring solution for terrorism? As we learned a lot of lessons, what came out of Levant, out of the Middle East, and Syria and Iraq, and it emanated downward. Because it's important that I put this statistic out there. In 2007, the global percentage of terrorism on the African continent was 2%. 2024, it's like 43%. It migrated down. That ideology migrated down in some some fighters did come through the Maghreb. The just a number of things, the Arab Spring, and the Libya downfall, but that narrative came down into the Sahel. So we're finding out that this jihad and this Islamic extremism kind of resonates with some of the populations and the marginalized populations across the Sahel, and it took hold and it turned very toxic. It turned to an atrocity, whereas these armed gangs took on a caliphate, a desire for a caliphate, which really stoked terrorism. So how do these countries meet this? There's a number of ways. None are modeling a simulation. This is not just kinetics. It's not just being able to have offensive operations to clear. It's a whole of government approach by these African countries, building in education systems, building in the true sense of religion in these populations and providing services so these military-age males are not indoctrinated.
Okay, can you pause it over there? Then let's get back. Now, I want to find out from you, if I sent you the video, right? In that video, he considered terrorism to be the greatest threat, right? And he said in 2007, a global percentage of terrorism on the African continent was 2%. Now in 2023, it has moved to 43%, right? Is it right to say that the greatest threat to the African continent is terrorism? Is it right to say that?
Well, I don't know. I think that for some countries that is true, right? That is true in the Sahel. That is not an issue in Southern Africa.
Right.
That is a very there are parts obviously of northern Mozambique and in eastern DRC where there are terrorist groups that operate. I guess I would be bigger than that, and I would talk about that certainly insecurity is one of the greatest threats to the African continent, and the way in which you address it is about having good governance and
okay, hold on. When you use the word insecurity, right? Are you referring to homeland security and not threat from terrorism?
When I say the word insecurity, what I'm talking about is, yes, extremism, but also militia and gangs such as the Mai Mai that operate in Congo, or about militancy in the Niger Delta, or about civil war in Sudan and Ethiopia. I don't think it's just about terrorism is there are places on the continent where it is quite severe, and in the Sahel, as General Langley said, it's the epicenter of terrorism in the world. But I think that if you're going to say to Africa, then it's not terrorism, it's insecurity.
Okay. All right. So let me follow up on this thing. Last year, there were a whole lot of demonstrations across the African continent, starting from what happened in Kenya, right? The finance bill. Gen Z had to demonstrate, right? Then it went to Uganda. Then it came somewhere to Nigeria, let the poor breathe. Then it came to Ghana, where a whole lot of people have fallen into poverty. So if we are talking about internal issues, right, then poverty or public debt, right, because that is what people are demonstrating against. Almost all across African countries, the level of poverty is still high. The level of lawlessness is still high, right? But Africans themselves do not see terrorism to be a threat. Like you say, it is in the Sahel, right? It's somewhere in the Lake Chad Basin. Then you go to Somalia, then you come to coastal West Africa, just a small countries. But for you to say the greatest threat for the entire African continent is terrorism, that becomes problematic for people who are experts on that particular subject.
I didn't say it was terrorism.
Okay, so what would you say is the threat, the greatest threat? You said insecurity. Where insecurity means what exactly?
So, Benjamin, in the Africa strategy, the objective that we're talking about, I did something that was the first time ever, which is that I put together the issue of good governance and security. And I do think that that insecurity or economic deprivation and unrest or a sense from publics that their governments aren't delivering, I think those are all related. So instead of, as in the Obama strategy, where democracy, I think it was called strengthen democratic institutions, was separate from advanced peace and security, I put those two categories together because I don't think you can separate them. The truth is, I don't think you can separate governance from any of the things that we're talking about here. When governments deliver services and are responsive to their publics, you get better outcomes. So that is the way that I conceive of it. I probably don't usually think about like what's the greatest threat. I think about what's the most important solution. And the most important solution is to have governments that are responsive to their publics, who are not creating, who are delivering prosperity because they're creating a level playing field for investment. There's not corruption, that have courts that work so they can adjudicate disputes, civil or criminal, and law enforcement that respects human rights. And if you have those things, you actually don't get insecurity, right? Those things are actually the antidote to insecurity. And by separating them, as in past strategies did, not in the one that I wrote for President Biden, I think that you create a trade-off, even if you don't realize it. You say, well, we're gonna have to do more on democracy, or we're gonna do more on security. And the reality is they're connected.
All right, let me still follow up on this here about the democracy thing that we are talking about, right? Now, so we have, if you are looking at what democratic dividends. Okay, first of all, let's try to be on the same page. When you say democratic dividends, what actually do you mean?
What I mean when I say democratic dividends, it's actually democratic and security dividends, is that people can choose their governments. They can live their lives, with an ability to make decisions free of interference, and they're able to grow prosperous. They're able to be free from fear. That's a dividend of democracy when democracy works, which, by the way, democracies are struggling all over the world, including in the United States. So I don't mean to say that it's easy, and I don't mean to say that I know the answers, but I still fundamentally believe, and by the way, most Africans believe, Africans believe in democracy more than any other region, according to polling. They just believe that it's in short supply. So that's what I mean is when you have security and democratic dividends, you have people who can make their own choices, who can influence their government, who have access to services, who can prosper, who can thrive.
Okay, yeah, let me follow up. One of the things that you said when we come to democracy, right, we do not have them in Africa. The point is for Africans, when we say democracy is holding elections. That is the basic yardstick for measuring democracy in Africa. Right. Now, there are some democratic government, like we saw what happened in Gabon. They do hold elections all the time, right? But there are no dividends to the people. Now, we have a situation where you have a military regime, right? Let's see what is happening in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, right? They are not democracies, but at least they are able to do certain things to prosper their people. Why should Africans not vouch for that than to vouch for democracy where we hold elections and the election does not translate into any dividend that benefits the people?
Well, first of all, I didn't say that there was no democracy in Africa. What I said is that according to polling, such as Afrobarometer, that 68% of Africans want democracy. That is the highest in the world, but they believe that it is in low supply. In other words, they are disappointed with the quality of their democracy. Um, that's one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is I don't believe that the US should impose anything on Africans. I'm just going by what Africans say. So African polling says they want democracy. Agenda 2063 says they support democracy. So, think that we should listen to Africans and what they want. And they have said in formal documents and in polling that they want democracy, but they want it to work well. I also disagree that elections are the yardstick of democracy. What is the yardstick of democracy, and elections are part of that equation, is governments that are responsive to their publics, and the publics have an ability to express their support or discontent, and they're able to do that freely. In Burkina Faso,
that is the ideal world. That's the ideal world, the way it should work.
yes, that's what we're all striving for.
Yeah, but in Africa, that is not the way it works. So that's why if you look at most polls, right, it says what the basic element for trying to measure democracy in Africa has to do with elections. That is the basic, right? Because we know that the other areas, there are shortfalls. So if we have a government, a democracy, which holds elections, but is not able to provide for the people in terms of dividends or in terms of prosperity, and you have, for example, a military regime which is able to do that, why shouldn't that be an option? Because, for example, in the US, for example, there is an agreement on both sides, whether Republican or Democrats, right? That democracy is the way out. On the African continent, they have not agreed that democracy is the way out. They see military regime as a substitute, as an alternative to democracy, which do not work well. So if they choose to have a military regime that is delivering to the people, why shouldn't that be an option?
Again, it's not my role to decide what are the options or what African governments should do. I'm just telling you what I understand from polling and from the formal documents of governments and of the African Union and ECOWAS and all of those different factors. Now, it is true, by the way, people don't decide to have a coup or a military government. That happens. Now they may be supportive of it once they have seized power, but it's rare where there's a public outcry that we need to have a military government and then the military steps in. Even in some of the cases, like in 1983 in Nigeria or some of the other coups, there was deep disaffection with the government, but I'm hard pressed to find examples where they're like, we need the military to step back in, and at least saying that in a focused or a collective a way that collectively represents the population. What I do think is we're going to find out if these governments that have taken over by power, like in the Sahel, if they deliver for their people. Right now, Burkina is 60% controlled by terrorist groups. Right now, in some of these countries, like in Mali, the opposition political parties have been dissolved. Right now, in some of these countries, journalists have been arrested. So I don't know what the answer is right now. We've done this before, right? We've had military dictatorships,
yeah,
and they haven't proved so well. For example, in Mali, there was a coup in 1968, and that man Traoré held power until 1991. That's the same story in Niger and Burkina, where they had multiple coups throughout their history. And I don't know if they benefited from it. Again, it's not for me to decide. First of all, I'm not in government anymore anyway. But even if I was, I go by what do governments say they want? What do the people say they want? And then what is the experience and the performance of the governments that are in power? Also acknowledging that no one is perfect and this is hard. Turning around the dynamics in the Sahel is going to be very difficult, and it's not going to be just about killing terrorists. It's going to be about addressing the grievances and the concerns of the public that terrorist groups are able to exploit.
Okay. Now, let me still follow up. I'm very interested in this conversation, right? The African Union has its own policy in terms of norm as it relates to those who engage in all kinds of coup d'etats, right? Now, let's look, for example, in the case of Gabon, where Bongo was in power for that long, right? Then let's go to what is happening in Cameroon with Paul Biya being there. What could be the only way out to get rid of these two people? if not for coup d'etat?
Benjamin, there's a lot of examples of long-standing leaders who step down, who die in office, who are overthrown. Um, for example, in Angola, right? Dos Santos was in power from 1979 until 2018, and then he stepped down and left power. And then we have Lorenzo. Um, we have, other examples like Rawlings, who was in power first from 1979, and then he came back in 81, and then held an election where he won, and then another election where his party lost. So it isn't true that a coup is the only way in. But you the the most important thing is to how do you strive to have where publics are able to weigh in and express their discontent. So, I don't think there are great answers to any of these questions. They're very difficult when you have leaders who have been in power for a very long time. But I would just say, looking at a host of examples, it doesn't have to end in a coup to necessarily see a huge turnover in leadership. It can be because a leader steps down, and there are examples of that. It can be because a country has decided to have elections. The BDP in Botswana. I mean, it's a strong democracy, but they have been in power since 1968, and they had an election, and where Masisi lost. Now they've had power alteration, but I think that is still an example of longtime parties or leaders who who step down from power, or who have an election that leads to a different result and a different outcome.
Yeah, I keep asking this question because the African Union has a norm in terms of those who engage in coup d'etat and it doesn't want to deal with them, right? So those who have been in power for so long, you do a coup d'etat, then there are a lot of sanctions on you. But those who have been in power for 30, 40 years, denying their people, right, the dividends or the prosperity, the African Union does not have a policy towards those people. So it seems like it's some sort of hypocrisy, right? You would agree with me. Those who have been there and depriving their people of their resources for 30, 40 years, there's nothing wrong with them. Let them be back over there. But when there's a coup d'etat, right, and the person takes over, then right up, there's a sanction on them. So it's like, what is the motivation for those people who have been in power to get out of power if the African Union does not have a policy against them to get out of power? That's
Well,
my thinking.
I think you should raise it with the African Union.
All right. Right. All right. So let's continue. So let's go back to the other narrative that I sent to you, which has to do with the resurgence of coup d'etat in the Sahel and coastal West Africa region. Right. There are some who make the argument that it is the kind of coup d'etat that we are having in that area has to do with U.S. military assertiveness in the Sahel and the coastal West African region. What is your take on that?
I don't believe that. So I've spent a lot of time, Benjamin, studying coups, a lot of time. Um, uh, Starting from the January 66 coup in Nigeria, looking at the Mobutu coup in 61 or in 60. I've looked at almost all of the coups around the continent. And what's happens in this argument is a conflation. Most coup leaders in Africa have either served uh, abroad or have had training. And I don't think that's a correlation between being a coup leader and being trained by the US or Morocco or France or the UK. I think what's interesting is the things that make one a successful coup leader: charisma, decisiveness, camaraderie, vision, happens to be the same things that are the reasons why they get promoted in the first place, happens to be the same reasons why they may go study abroad somewhere in the world, right? Like the 1966, January 96 coup leaders in Nigeria, they all were at like Sandhurst because they were up and comers. And so I know that people love to point to this, but I don't believe that there is a correlation. I believe that there's a certain individual who, if they decide to have that are often some of the most dynamic leaders, and if they decide to, and they would also be the ones who would have a coup.
All right, so let's explore that further, right? Now, if you look at the early years, the 70s and the 80s, the coups were actually undertaken by what lower level military officers, right?
Not
The
true.
Rawlins and those people, they were lower level. What we are experiencing now
That's
are
not
those
true.
on the higher level. Does it make a difference?
That's not true.
Okay.
So Rawlings was a flight lieutenant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sam Doe was an NCO. He's the only NCO who's taken power. Ibrahim Babangida was the chief of army staff. Traore was in Mali was a senior leader in '68. Idi Amin was the head of the Ugandan military. So was Bakassa in Car. So you actually have both. So some coups are led by senior officers, like we have today in Niger, and some of them historically have also been led by junior mid-level officers, which is the case today in Burkina Faso with a captain, or in Mali with colonels. So there's just not, it's not that we have seen it go from senior officers to junior officers or junior officers to senior officers. That if you looked at all of the coups on the continent, you would see a lot of both. And what happens is, if you're a junior officer, you probably have, or a mid-range officer, you probably have access to weapons. And if you're a senior officer, you have access to people. And the most interesting job that people tend to have that do coups, or at least who have co-opted, are people who lead brigade of guards or any sort of the presidential security guards. That was the case in Gabon. Or they're in communications, like Murtala Mohammed was in communications, so you can talk to a lot of people. So there tends to be, in a coup, different roles that people have, but it's not necessarily run by a junior officer or a senior officer. When Rawlings did that coup, right, the second coup, he was in prison. They freed him after the coup. So anyway, I just think I've spent a lot of time on this. I don't think there's a current pattern right now in terms of level of officer. And I think if you look at the coups that have happened just in the past, since 2020, there's a diversity of officers in terms of their rank.
All right, so let me go back to my original question, where I was trying to make the argument that U.S. military assertiveness has contributed to some of the military coups in there. Let's look at these three countries: Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Right, these are three countries that the U.S. has invested heavily, over $1 billion, into these three countries, and most of the money went to the French. It did not go to the Mali, to these three countries, their military forces, and these same three countries are the ones that have perpetrated coup d'etats. They have had the most investment, right? If you go back and look at the what.
Are you sure that's true? I don't know if that's true.
Okay,
I don't.
I can give you the figures, right? When you go back,
You think that we've given more security assistance to Burkina Faso than Nigeria or Ghana or Ethiopia?
Okay,
no, there's no way.
Let me give you some figures for us to work with under the pretext of terrorism, right? Right. So if you look at the figures, when we are fighting terrorism, right, we're talking about the Sahel Maghreb, which is one, right? Then you go to Lake Chad Basin, right? Then you go to the Horn of Africa. Now, let me give you the figures, right? Sahel Maghreb, under President Obama, right? Fiscal year 2015, right? They requested for $113 million, right? Then Lake Chad Basin, 113. East Africa, which is the Horn of Africa, is what, 466. Then you go to fiscal year 2015, Maghreb, 262. Then you go to the Chad Basin, 338. East Africa, 669. So these are the countries that have received the most military aid from the Counterterrorism Defense Fund, which was established by Obama. So they have received the most aid. So the argument is that.
No, but what I'm saying, Benjamin, what I'm saying to you is that you have picked three countries to point out where there's been coups, whereas that the Lake Chad Basin includes Nigeria. You don't think Nigeria gets a disproportionate amount of counterterrorism funding relative to those countries? The Horn of Africa, we weren't giving counterterrorism funding in any substantial way to Sudan. So now you're talking about Ethiopia and Somalia. Neither of those countries have had coups, or Kenya, which hasn't had a coup. None of the Maghreb countries that you just mentioned have had a coup. So
Sahel Maghreb. It's Sahel Maghreb. So
I'm saying, but in the Maghreb, there's not been a coup in Tunisia. There's not been a coup in Algeria.
There was one in Egypt.
There was one in Egypt. Sure, there was one in Egypt. But I listen, I don't know the answer to this, but I don't believe that it's security assistance, that there's a correlation between U.S. security assistance and coup d'etats. Especially because most of the coup d'etats in the history of Africa happened when we weren't doing many security assistance at all, right? Like we've had 8 coups since 2020, right? We've had 1 in Gabon, 2 in Mali, 2 in Burkina, 1 in Sudan, 1 in Niger, right? And then when you look at the 90s and 80s and 70s, much more coups have happened, and we didn't do much security assistance.
So what is it so unique about those 3 countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso? What is so unique about them that these are the 3 countries that have received substantial U.S. military assistance from the Counterterrorism Defense Fund, and that is these 3 countries are the ones that have been engaged in coup d'etat? What is so unique about those 3 countries?
Well, I think those 3 countries in particular, although again, they're not the only countries. Somalia faces significant terrorism threats. So does northern Mozambique. But those countries, in the case of Burkina, obviously have are overrun by extremism. Burkina Faso has had multiple coups in its history since January of 1966 or February of 1966. Niger has had several coups in their history. Mali's only had 3. But I think that what's happened in those countries, irregardless of whether there is U.S. or French or a UN mission there, is that in those countries, there has been an inability to address the counterterrorism fight. And all 3 of those countries were under civilian rule at that point, right? Kabore in Burkina Faso, or Ibeka in Mali, or Isufu and then Bazoum in Niger, although Niger, the terrorism threat was actually going down. But I think in those cases, military leaders decided that the civilians weren't capable of prosecuting the fight. And now they've taken over, and we will see if they do better. Right now, they're struggling. They're struggling to actually reverse the tide of extremism in those countries. But, there are some of those reasons may be genuine, and some of those may be only part of the story. I don't know. But again, this is a very complicated subject, Benjamin, and I don't know if there's simple answers to it. I don't think there's simple answers to explain the phenomenon of coups. And I certainly don't think that there's some sort of easy connect A to B on security assistance.
Right. So since we are on coup, right, let's go back to what is happening in Somalia. There's been a couple of attempts, right? Attempts on the president's life, right? We're talking about terrorism, right? The issue in Somalia, right? Is it more about terrorism, or is it more about a greater Somalia which poses a threat to Ethiopia and Kenya?
I'm sorry.
I'm asking the situation in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is playing a key role over there. I'm asking whether Somalia, the issue is more about Al-Shabaab or terrorism, or is about a greater Somalia, like a peaceful Somalia, which will become a threat, right, to Ethiopia and to Kenya. Because don't forget that the Ogaden region was part of Somalia. The northern territories in Kenya was also part of Somalia. So a greater Somalia poses a threat to Ethiopia and to Kenya.
Well, I don't think we've seen an irredentist or expansionist Somalia since 1988, right? Once the fighting started in Somalia land. And actually even before that, maybe, the war in the Ogaden was 77. Um, and then, you haven't seen that kind of actions from the Somali government, whatever iteration of it is. Somalia, the government collapsed in 1991, and the US government only recognized a government in Somalia in 2012. So for 2 decades, the country was governed largely ungoverned or undergoverned or ruled by clan authorities or Islamic courts or terrorist groups or militias. And I think that became a toxic um, environment in which a group like Shabab could rise to power. But I don't think it's a greater Somalia that is the problem. The problem is, to get back to our earlier point, I think it's about the lack of government and people feeling that they didn't have a way to take care of themselves, to have fair um, adjudication of disputes, to raise a living, take care of their families, some of the basic things, in a sense of the and that vacuum gave an opportunity for a group like Shabab.
Okay. Now, what would be Ethiopia's and Kenya's interest in seeing a peaceful Somalia? What would be their interest? To see a more stable Somalia. What would be Ethiopia's interest? What would be Kenya's interest in
Well,
seeing?
I can tell you that Kenya would love to see security on its border. So would Ethiopia.
What about those in the diaspora still talking about Israel? They want the greater Somalia. They want to get all those territories back. That has not died down yet.
I don't look. I don't see that. I mean, the whole idea of uniting the Somali part of northeast Nigeria, Kenya, or of the Ogaden or Djibouti, right? The five stars. I haven't seen that sentiment expressed in a very long time. It is true that it was historic. That's why they have five stars, but I don't think that's the issue du jour.
Okay, all right. So let's go on to the next narrative. We talked about the OIG report, right? In terms of the misappropriation of funds and mismanagement of funds for the counterterrorism fund and the transfer those funds, right? Now, if you read the report very carefully, it talks about whole mismanagement of some of the resources. Now, somewhere in 2013 or 2014, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations during the U.S. the UN in Ghana made some comments blaming the Russians for the Wagner Group for what is happening in the Sahel. Right. My question is, the Russians have been there since 2019, only 2019. The US has been there as far back as 2001. So why is it that the blame is now being shifted onto the Wagner Group or the Russian mercenaries when it is the OIG who has come up with audit and talks about money being misapplied in that particular Sahel region? Why should the blame be on the Russians and not be on the Bureau of African Affairs who had mismanaged the resources that was meant for CT in that region? Why should that be the case? Why should it be the Russians' fault? Since they've been there only in 2019.
I'm not sure I fully understand the argument that you're going to make. So, and I don't know the particulars of the OIG investigation on TSCTP. I do know that, first of all, the State Department isn't the only part of the U.S. government that does counterterrorism, right? That's multi-agencies that do that, including the Department of Defense. And I know that the U.S. government has worked closely with governments in the region to try to address the counterterrorism problem. The Russians have shown up, and since they have arrived, for example, in Mali, there's been a 270% increase in civilian deaths. The Russians encouraged, or the Russians and the Malians, the Russians encouraged the Malians to kick out the UN. I'm not sure how that all came together, but the UN's gone. So I think that you're taking what is a strength of a democracy, which is investigating itself and addressing any shortfalls so they can better deliver services, and then you're conflating that with that's responsible for or the terrorism threat. I don't know. I don't think that's true. I do know that the Russians' arrival in these countries have not made these countries safer,
Yeah,
and
but
have led.
my point is that the Russians have been there since 2019, just about 6 years ago. The US has been there for two
Ollie,
decades, right? The US has been there for 2 decades. So for all these 2 decades and all the money that has been spent over there, we could not find a solution to the problem. So why all of a sudden within 6 years, all the blame is now on the Russians?
I don't
How is
listen.
that possible?
I don't know. I don't think all the blame is on the Russians. I think there are things that one can point to that we know from UN reports and other things that the Russians are doing that is not helping the case for stability in the Sahel. But I think we're missing the bigger picture, which is this is a real significant problem that is not going to be erased just by taking terrorists off the battlefield. And it's an investment in governance that you need an African partner for. And it's hard. It's hard to do it in Afghanistan. It was hard to do it in Iraq, and it's hard to do it in the Sahel. So I think that um, the fact that the extremist challenge in the Sahel is not getting better is a, a hint to how hard it is to do this well. Now, do I think the Russians are contributing positively to this? No, absolutely not. Do I think that the U.S. should be doing more? Of course. Do I think that that will lead in 5 years or 10 years to the diminution, like to the reduction of the terrorist threat? I hope so, but I don't know if that's true. It's going to take a long time. Nigeria has been dealing with the threat from Boko Haram for 10 years now.
Yeah,
We have probably about just a minute or so left, Benjamin, but I want to tell you that I'm really thankful for this opportunity. You know, having these conversations is how we all get better. I'm learning a lot from you and your questions. I hope my answers have helped put a spotlight on how I think, because I don't speak for the US government anymore.
sure.
And the only way we're going to find out better solutions is to keep having these arguments and trying to separate causality and correlation and think carefully about how complex it is to solve these problems, how they got here, and how we resolve them.
All right. So, okay, if any of my participants has questions, feel free to ask the questions. If anybody has any question.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting conversation. My question is related to the information disorder, which is also one of the issues that kind of like not new, but is also able to sway or you know, redraw the ways in which we see the different conflicts that we're living in the Sahel and Africa broadly. I'm not saying that disinformation or all this information disorder is an African issue, but it is really felt by observers of the phenomena. Um, and my question is really, what is the U.S. strategy? I know it's a local issue and it has to be dealt with locally, but I also understand that those big houses, Meta, with all of these giants that are providing those platforms, are not African. So, what is one of the questions that we get asked all the time is, what is the role in helping design technology that AI, for that matter, is a very good thing to insert here. What is the role in helping us, combat disinformation, information disorder, and what is the role of governments, stable governments like the USA in doing that? Considering that it's no longer a matter of information disorder, it's even a communication disorder that we're seeing emerge here and there. You know, you see a narrative. Even me as a scholar, I encounter narratives that an avalanche of narratives sometimes that can unsettle one. So I'm wondering whether you have I know you don't have much time left, but a reflection to take in that direction.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it's a really important question. Um, One of the things that we wanted to do when we wrote the Africa strategy, and I think that this was something that I'm very proud of during the Biden administration, is we wanted to have more African leadership on the global issues of the day, including tech. And that's why we pushed for the African Union to join the G20. That's why we added another seat for Africa at the IMF. That's why we helped increase the number of Africans in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's why we called for two permanent seats for Africa in the Security Council, because Africans need to be part of this conversation. And specifically on AI and technology and misinformation. This is something that we were doing in the Biden administration in Nigeria when President Ruto came to the United States. We also talked to him about that. So I think, again, I'm not in government. I think, first of all, this is a very difficult challenge that we in America struggle with as much as anyone in Africa, as you know well. But we need to bring a global community together on some of these questions. And I think we're going to have the best solutions with African leaders in the front. So that's more of a framework for how I think about it. The tactics are very complicated and difficult, and there's a lot of trial and error. I've seen it not go very well in trying to counter disinformation. And there's been cases where disinformation has been challenged and disproven and neutralized, but because the space continues to evolve so quickly, it's hard to keep up. So part of this is starting at the macro level with a general framework and buy-in, and then trying to think through what the tactics are.
But let me follow up. Are you aware of this disinformation on YouTube about a coup d'etat in Cote d'Ivoire?
I saw it. Yes, I saw it.
Yeah. So what was your take? What were you thinking? Because I had a couple of friends calling me all the way from South Sudan, and I was like, if you are aware, just go to the State Department website to see whether there are any kind of alerts, right, in terms of, because they are U.S. citizens in South Sudan. So I directed them over there. So it seems like this is becoming a big problem for the continent, but it seems like the African leaders themselves have not found a way out in terms of how to deal with it.
Well, I mean, the government of Ouattara had a cabinet meeting and came out and said there's no coup d'etat. The Nigerians have had to do a similar thing when there's been rumors that Buhari was dead, if you remember that, and he had been replaced. So the disinformation continues. One of the best things that one can do, I think, from a government side, is to come out clearly and show that it's false. I think for us as citizens, one of the best things that we can do is not spread rumors. Is once you get the text from someone, instead of just sending it off to the next person, is you take a look at it and you say, well, this doesn't seem right. I'm not going to move it forward. So you can kind of help diminish the virality by in your own social groups by saying this seems false. And there's a bunch of false stories right now that are circulating, and the best thing to do is to come out very clearly with that why it's incorrect, but even better, just don't share them. Don't let them take on life of their own.
Yeah. Any more questions before I allow him to go? Okay, let me ask you the last question. So what happened to the Biden's executive executive instrument on the diaspora council, the Council of Diaspora Engagement? Because it seems like it was an executive order and is now gone. Probably should have gone to the House or gone to Congress to pass it, right? Because the diaspora has a key role to play. Was it the right thing to use an executive instrument to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that I was very proud of, establishing the Presidential Advisory Council on Africa and Diaspora Engagement. Oftentimes, you start with an executive order, and then you hope to put it into legislation. That was in the mix before the end of the Biden administration's term. But when President Trump came in, he rescinded a bunch of executive orders, including that one. So it's gone.
Yeah, I just want to bring to your attention, Howard University is considering establish what you call U.S. African Institute. right?
Mm.
Where they're going to trade middle or entry level or people, career people, professionals in terms of U.S. African politics. Do you think that would be a good thing to help
Sure,
Africans? Yeah.
of course. I believe, I went to an African Studies Center for graduate school. So I believe the more Americans and diaspora Americans are engaging in U.S.-Africa relations, studying the continent, that's all beneficial. That's
All right.
really important.
All right. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you for joining us today, Judd. We appreciate you
Thank you.
coming over, trying to share some of your views on the Sankofa African Review. We hope to have you in the past. I'll keep reading some of your articles that you write, and they are very, very interesting. We'll keep posting them online for our viewers to go through them. All right.
Thank you.
So on this note,
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity. Have a wonderful Friday.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. So on this note,
Bye.
we come to the end of another Sankofa African Review. We hope to see you next week. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.